Yes, we are live. Welcome to another webinar organized by the Turkish Center for Global and Area Studies at Necmettin Erbakan University. My name is Branislav Radelic, and I'm Professor of International Relations at the Faculty of Political Science. Today, it is our pleasure to host Dr. Vladimir Vučković from the Department of International Relations and European Studies at Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. Vladimir, thank you very much for being with us. I will just a couple of words about Vladimir. I know his research very well. He has been focusing on Europeanization of the Western Balkans, European Union enlargement policy, foreign policy of the Western Balkans, and the NATO enlargement policy. I'm sure there are some other aspects that you cover in your great research, but I would say these are the main ones. He has published a good number of journal articles. He has edited a book on Europeanization of the Western Balkans, and he has just finished a manuscript about Montenegro, and I would really like to hear more about your project and what is it that you have discovered that we have not known before. So in preparation for our session today, we decided to focus on the role of external forces in the Western Balkans, and in this respect, Vladimir will tell us about the EU, but also about the role of China, Russia, and Turkey. So without further ado, Vladimir, please share your ideas and research with us. Once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Professor Radelic. I'm very happy and also grateful that I have an opportunity to talk on such an interesting topic, and that is definitely the external powers and their influence in the Western Balkan region. As I said, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here at the Turkish Center for the Global and Area Studies at the Necmettin Erbakan University. Today we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, especially when it comes to the Western Balkans and its further perspectives. Also, when we talk about this topic, we're going to focus on the certain geostrategic, but also geopolitical aspects, which are quite important for the development of the Western Balkans, but also their foreign policy perspectives. Personally, I'm going to share you some of my thoughts, which I have been developing in my new book, which is going to be published next year by American publisher Lexington, and the title of this particular book is The European Union Charade in Europeanizing Montenegro. Of course, as I'm focusing on Montenegro, also these particular cases can be also applicable to the different Western Balkan countries, especially when you talk about the foreign policy aspect, but perhaps far more importantly, I would say alignment with the membership criteria and those I would say problems which the Western Balkans, or in particular Montenegro, was facing during his integration period. So some of you are maybe asking why I'm particularly focusing on Montenegro and why this is country quite important to be researched. As we already know, it's a very tiny country in the Balkan Peninsula in the Adriatic coast. Well, there are several aspects. I would say 5 or 6 reasons why I have chosen to focus, but also to elaborate the influence of the external factors when it comes to the Western Balkan region, especially when we talk about the European Union, but also other very important international factors such as Turkey, Russia, and China. Well, as I said, there are many reasons why I have been focusing on the case study of Montenegro. First, Montenegro, for a very short period of time after declaring its independence from Serbia in 2006, has demonstrated a very remarkable progress when it comes to effective compliance of the Copenhagen membership criteria towards the being part of the European Union. So as of June 2020, this country has already opened 33 negotiating chapters, including chapters 23, Judiciary and Fundamental Rights, and also chapters 24, Justice, Freedom and Security. therefore position itself as a regional frontrunner among the all Western Balkan countries. Second, in line with new, I would say, accession negotiation process which start from 2012 when Montenegro opened the accession negotiation process. There have been further specification of the terms of dynamic of opening accession negotiation chapters. The chapters starts with the chapters, the accession negotiation process starts with the chapters 23, 24, and they become the very heart of the accession process by focusing primarily on the rule of law requirements together with the constant evaluation and monitoring during the entire stage. In addition, the European Union has set the interim benchmark, but also opening and closing benchmark for opening accession negotiations with Montenegro. Third, there is an anonymous consensus among the all political parties towards the EU membership issue when it comes to Montenegro. And this is not the case when it comes to the rest of Western Balkan countries, especially we talk about the Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, but also when we talk about the Serbia. Fourth, reasons which I would say why Montenegro is important is that after the break of the NATO enlargement policy, Montenegro has become one of new member state, to be more precise, 29 member state of alliance in 2017, which means that the country has fulfilled necessary requirements within the rule of law reforms, equally demanding and complex process as it was the case with the EU enlargement policy. However, although the country has become one of the youngest NATO member states, this country still suffers from the weak governance and the widely perceived corruption, which is seen within the entire Western Balkan region. The existence of non-consolidated democracy in Montenegro has opened opportunity for domestic political elites to use decision-making process for the private purposes and to misuse prerogatives in order to ensure that adopted political decisions are largely in favor of clientelistic interest. The widespread corruption, which is case not just when it comes to Montenegro, but also when it comes to the Western Balkan region itself, substantially undermine the state capacity, weaken its legitimacy, consequently resulting with the ultimately weak state. Last but not the least, before I go elaborating and start talking about topic which is more related with the international influence within the Western Balkan region, as it was the case with the other countries from the region, Montenegro is strongly subject to the influence of stabilitocracy, which means a weak democracy with autocratically minded leader who govern two informal patronage networks and claims to provide the pro-Western stability in the region. It's a quite new phenomenon, which is happening in particular in the Western Balkan region, when the so-called semi-authoritarian regimes are using the pro-Western preferences in order to maintain this sort of internal political stability and therefore trying to erode democratic safeguards. In case of Montenegro, for instance, the former ruling party, which was ruling over Montenegro for more than 30 years, and this is quite important fact since the introduction of the multi-party system, has used, in this particular case, the NATO membership to portray itself as an indispensable factor of stability. I would like to mention a fact that Montenegro has been the only post-communist country with one-party system, Democratic Party of Socialists of Montenegro, ruling its in continuity since the introduction of the multi-party system. As of this year, as of 4th of December, we can say a couple of days ago, there is the first democratically elected government actually imposed or established in Montenegro, which means that for the first time, this political party and its leader has become the opposition parties. What is also important to mention is that besides these main capabilities to maintain and consolidate the power, the former prime minister and the current president of Montenegro, the most prominent political figure, I would say, in Montenegro for during the modern historical times, has created a sort of clan of closely allies who possess a strong political and economical power and deeply affect the internal political processes and the changes in the society. This sort of existence of democratic system really obscures the situation in the country where the ruling DPS continuously control many aspects of the society, particularly in the domain of pressure on voters, those that are working in the state and public institutions, but also those voters who are neutral or with a, I would say, poor financial status. In any respect, clientelism and patronism has played a very significant role in the DPS strategy of remaining the power for so many reasons. As I said, this sort of fast advancement, which I was mentioning when it comes to case of Montenegro, has been continuously highlighted and also supported by high-ranking EU officials, saying that this is the country of, as a champions of European integration, the good news story, the success European story, which at the same time has remained a testament to Montenegrin success story. However, after Montenegro declared independence from Serbia in 2006, we have to be quite clear and say that Montenegro has made a progress in the European integration process as a result of two lucky combinations. The status of the country, which is not contested either internally or externally, which is the case, for instance, with Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. And as I said even before, there is an unanimous consensus of all political parties regarding the EU membership issue. Still, the Montenegrin advancement in the EU accession process does not seem to depend on the capacity of domestic actors to induce the sort of domestic governmental changes. Rather, it is the completely driven process in which the European Union positions itself as a major actor of domestic changes. So far, I can be sure and say that so far, the European Union has imposed sort of pressure in two cases. The first one is the visa liberalization process happening in 2009, the most influential so far conditional mechanism imposed by the European Union towards Montenegro, but towards the rest of the Western Balkan countries as well. And there is the opinion which is stipulated from the European Commission before Montenegro started opening the accession negotiations, as I said, in 2012. Unlike the praise of the EU officials of Montenegro as a good news story, as a lighthouse of European integration, the champions of EU integration, I personally argue that the European Union has essentially failed to induce pressure over Montenegro in order to comply in the membership condition. Respectively, this or my book, what actually I was written in the title, as I mentioned before, the European Union charade in Europeanizing Montenegro, has argued that there is the negative transformative power which has been reduced by the European Union in the key accession criteria from the period from 2007 as the period when actually Montenegro started being involved in the accession process until this present date. And therefore, this given deficiency of the fulfillment political conditions in Montenegro is primarily the result of inconsistent and insufficient EU enlargement policy, or EU conditional policy to be precise, and unfavorable domestic conditions, the lack of political will among the all to appropriately conduct reform activities, thus resulting with weak and mitigating reform progress. In this respect, this particular research, or my particular research to be more precise, claims that the European Union foreign policy is a form of, or contains the characteristics of a process of charade when it comes to European integration of Montenegro. And this particular point may be witnessed not only when we talk about the Montenegro, but also when we talk about the Western Balkans in the terms of the EU enlargement policy being analyzed. Overall conditions under which the European Union has imposed its pressure towards Montenegro in order to address the political criteria, and these are mostly related to judiciary reform, fight against the corruption, improvement of regional relations, also solving open bilateral issues has been seen as an essentially faulty and uneven approach of the European Union towards the EU integration process. This long-lasting and faulty approach of the European Union towards Montenegro for more than a decade is primarily the result of correlation between the EU and domestic factors, which significantly mitigate the effective implementation and enforcement of the EU rules and norms. On one hand, Montenegro has been facing with far more complicated, demanding, complex accession conditions, ineffectiveness of the European Union as a state-building actor, and an enlargement fatigue. As a result, the European Union has defined the accession negotiations as an open-ended process, being consequently reluctant to provide any target date, any commitment towards the advancement of the relations between this country and the European Union, or between the Western Balkan region and EU. On the other hand, a certain set, I would say, internal problems, such as the limited statehood issues, the strong interference of the semi-authoritarian regime, and other veto players have substantially restrained the EU transformative power on domestic institutional and policy changes, not just, when I said once again, not in Montenegro, but also in the rest of the Western Balkan region. Therefore, the enlargement process without the goal and the sort of the accession without the credible membership perspective, followed by the state insufficient fulfillment of the condition due to the strong influence of veto players and autocratic leaders, is being defined as an EU charade in the process of European integration of Montenegro, but also when it comes to the rest of the Western Balkan region. If we compare it with the previous enlargement waves from 2007, from 2004, but also from 2030, when the last or first and last Western Balkan country joined the Union, such as Croatia, it is evident that the EU enlargement condition policy has become much more strict, demanding, and complex when it comes to the Western Balkan region. In that regard, the transformation of the EU enlargement conditional policy towards the southeastern Europe is being characterized by the classification and specification of a range and scope of the condition, all of which can be particularly classified within the following way. First, there is a growing relevance of the political conditions for the advancement in the EU accession process by focusing primarily on the rule of law requirements, fight against the corruption, and also delivering certain results when it comes to organized crime, together with the strict fulfillment of the so-called stabilization and association process conditions, which are more or less related only for the Western Balkan region due to the specific of the conflict that was actually happening during the 90s on the post-Yugoslav space. These conditions are more related with strengthening the regional cooperation, also cooperation with the ICTY, with International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, but also resolving open bilateral dispute as outstanding bilateral problems, which is one of the also quite interesting characteristic, quite seen specifically within the Western Balkan region. The second thing which I would like to emphasize is definitely introduction of opening, interim, and closing benchmarks, which emerge as an essential element of the enlargement strategy during the entire stage of the accession process, therefore consequently changing the entire dynamics of the membership talks. Third, and I have been mentioning before, the transformation of the accession negotiation is into the open-ended process, which means that the European Union has been opposed towards setting the target dates for the actual accession of this region into the European Union, as it was the case with the 2004 and 2007 enlargement, when 10 countries from Central and Eastern Europe, including Cyprus and Malta, joined the European Union. And finally, there is the introduction of the wide range preventive and remedial sanctions in the form of suspending implementation of the Stabilization Association Agreement, which is, for those who are not familiar, the first contractual relations established between the European Union and the Western Balkan country in order to advance in the accession process, as well as introduction of the different sort of disequilibrium clauses. I will say something about these particular clauses even after. Therefore, this sort of enlargement fatigue, which we are testing even today, has demonstrated discrepancy between the enlargement process and necessity of deepening the union policy, the issue so-called the issue of widening versus deepening, which opened the question for the so-called absorption capacity of the enlargement for the certain period of time. Following the case of the southeastern enlargement, this particularly means that the EU membership of the candidate country has not changed in the terms of the normative process of the accession, but rather it has changed in the terms of the final goal of the accession, and this is the integration of the Western Balkans into European Union. This process has become during the time more like a movement without the goal and the sort of the accession without the credible membership perspective. As a result, the progress of this country towards the EU membership issue is quite limited. The EU transformative power has not been has been insufficiently developed, mostly because the conditionality does not work if the membership criteria are not clear, if they're not equally applied to all the applicants, if they're not fairly monitored, and if there is a doubt that the reward will come once conditions are being met. Clearly, this is the case of the Western Balkans accession as such. All this story, when it comes to Western Balkan relations, in particular focus on Montenegro with European Union, has been done in order to provide a very simple question. And that is why the European Union has actually created this sort of given charade over the conditional process towards Montenegro, but also towards the Western Balkan region, and as I said numerous times during the whole integration phase. And there are a number of assumptions which can be used as a valuable explanation for overall problematic process of Europeanization of Montenegro as being conducted by the European Union. First, the European Union has aimed to preserve the legitimacy of the EU integration process in Montenegro, but also in the Western Balkan states, in particular, in order to maintain, I would say, internal political stability. The European Union has been involved in the various driven conditionality process by using the compliance with the Western Balkan countries, introducing the various wide range of the mechanisms, such as notably implementation of acquis, technical and financial support provided by the tax and twinning projects. Also, there is an instrument for the pre-accession assistance, socialization through the political dialogue and technical cooperation, etc., etc. So the European Union imposed a lot of different technical, also financial instruments in order to establish a more closer relationship with the Western Balkan countries. However, although the European Union introduced the various financial and technical assisting mechanisms in order to accelerate the candidate countries' membership towards the European Union, its reluctance to reaffirm the credible membership perspective, along with the introduction of new country-specific conditions, I already mentioned them, has been reflected in the candidate country intention to reconsider their geopolitical and foreign policy interests. It is not a rare case that the semi-authoritarian leaders in the Western Balkans largely use the logic of bargaining by choosing the policy of alternatives instead of the policy of opportunities, consequently opting for the certain international factors who are providing the higher benefits than the others. For instance, in case of Serbia, the European Union has established the disequilibrium clause, which can potentially postpone the advancement of the EU accession process if the normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina, between Serbia and Kosovo, are being compromised. As a result, Serbia, as the main regional actor, has changed its geopolitical and foreign policy perception, consequently strengthening the cooperation with Russia by signing a number political, economical, security, and military agreements, sending a very clear message that EU game, it's not only game in town. Second, it's quite clear that the European Union has kept this sort of enlargement charade on the top of its foreign policy agenda due to the strong involvement of other international factors, namely Russia, China, Turkey in the Western Balkan region. Without any doubt, for instance, the strong historical, cultural, political, economical influence of Russia in the Western Balkan countries as its traditional sphere of influence substantially raises serious concerns over the European Union when it comes to their proclaimed foreign policy towards maintaining the regional peace and stability. Given the Mearsheimer theory of neorealism based on the concept of offensive realism, it seems that the European Union and Russia are continuously trying to maximize their respective power by looking the opportunity at the expenses of other rivals. In other words, the European Union is seeking to weaken and to reduce the Russian impact by providing a wide range of accession advancement reward to the Western Balkan country, but without the credible membership perspective. When I say a wide range of accession advancement reward, I'm thinking about adoption of the Stabilization Association Agreement, implementation of the Stabilization Association Agreement, opening accession negotiation, various technical and financial mechanisms, but not providing, as I said, the credible membership perspective due to the fact that still the European Union has been reluctant toward providing a target date for the credibility of this particular process. However, I would like to mention that importance of investigating the case study of Montenegro has become quite more relevant, not just when we talk about Montenegro, but also when we talk about the rest of the Western Balkan region, after the European Union finally introduced the so-called credible membership perspective for the Western Balkan region in February 2018 by providing sort of possibility for Serbia and Montenegro as a regional frontrunners to join the European Union. However, the geopolitical significance of the region for the European Union has increased substantially after the growing involvement of other international power and their respect and use of the soft power influence in the same area by Russia, China, and by Turkey. On the other hand, as I mentioned, European Union, Russia uses various soft and hard power means in order to destabilize the Western Balkans and also to destabilize the European Union itself. As I said, even further, when we talk about Russia, in line with the concept of offensive realism, the Western Balkans have emerged at the top of the Russian foreign policy agenda during the last decades as a wave of geopolitical confrontation with United States and European Union. The strategy of competition once again has arisen rapidly after the adoption of the foreign policy concept, first in 2002 and then in 2030, clearly defining the three main foreign policy goals for Russia: remaining the nuclear power, becoming the great power, and also remaining the regional hegemon. This sort of zero-sum approach has been of utmost importance for Moscow foreign policy towards the Western Balkans as an important area for maintaining the Russian influence and a buffer zone in which the Russia is given a dominant position. In this particular sense, I would like to mention that Russia has profound relations with many Western Balkan countries, including Montenegro, through the existence of the strong historical, cultural, and also political ties. This sort of, in particular, when we talk about Montenegro, this sort of political and historical connections between the two Slavic countries have been further strengthened after Montenegrin independence, when Russia started investing in developing the post-transition Montenegrin economy. The presence of the Russian influence is also seen in this small Adriatic coast through the increase of the Russians purchases of the real estate, therefore growing or increasing the growth of the properties of on the real estate on Montenegrin coast. Also, Russia has been strongly supported Montenegrin tourism, where the Russian citizens has become one of the most largest travelers visiting Montenegro. However, Russia uses opportunities of uneven soft and hard power means within the broad policy area, taking the advantage to expand its influence and potentially to undermine the regional stability by using the various outcomes, such as the outcomes of the Brexit crisis, such as the crisis of the Eurozone, enlargement fatigue, high unemployment within the Western Balkan region. Russia continuously seeks to leverage its substantial influence by undermining the values of the EU and NATO and their achievements in the Western Balkan region. The Russian opinions towards the Western Balkans is predominantly determined by its relations to the West. During the time, for instance, of Medvedev presidency, Moscow demonstrated no objections towards the enlargement process of uh, Albania and Croatia in 2009, while the post-Crimea Russia has started observing the region from the zero-sum perspective, where the Western gain is the Russian loss. Many scholars agree primarily that the Russia contains the characteristics of opportunistic spoiler. By using of maintaining the supposed brotherhood, Russia has underpinned its foreign policy actions through the strong interference into the regional and internal political processes and the changes. At the same time, it has been reluctant to provide the regional alternative perspective for achieving stability and prosperity compared to the Western models. Notably, Russia does not have a long-term strategy for development of the relations with the Western Balkan countries, as it was the case with the EU enlargement policy. However, their advantages are seen in the flexible actions and the swift decision. In order to gain the supremacy in the Western Balkan space and therefore to undermine the credibility of the alliance and the European Union into the region, Russia used both soft and hard power means mechanisms in order to destabilize the region, such as financing eligible political parties, mostly, I would say, pro-Serbian, pro-Russian individuals and the political parties, establishing anti-Western medias, strengthening political corruption and clientelism, but also inspiring sort of coups. By viewing the Western Balkans as a traditional sphere of the influence, Russia has strongly opposed towards the NATO enlargement policy in the Western Balkans, but in recent years towards the integration process as well. This sort of worsening relationship between Montenegro and Russia was primarily influenced by the Montenegrin decision to align with the EU sanctions against Russia following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but also Montenegrin will to join the NATO in 2017. As a result, the Montenegrin foreign policy actions have been perceived by Kremlin as a hostile, which been reflecting in continuous decline trends when it comes to development of the economy and the political aspects. At the first instance, Russia mainly used the soft power tools in order to prevent the state intention towards joining the European Union, such as the strong political accusation from the high-ranking Russian political officials, such as in particular from the Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin, saying that Montenegro will regret if joining the NATO, but also even surprisingly from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who also stated that Montenegro is sacrificing its economical relations with Russia by joining the NATO. Also, there were another incidents such as when Russian foreign minister warned not to travel in Montenegro, while Russia's state media immediately start running a negative campaign by portraying Montenegro as corrupt and extremely insecure. And finally, there was a ban of Montenegrin wines over the alleged hygiene concerns. The latest in the series of confrontation between two countries occurred primarily in 2016, just a few months before the Montenegrin acquisition to the full membership in NATO, when Montenegro accused Russia of meddling in 2016 parliamentary elections by attempting to overthrow the former prime minister and current president of Montenegro, as I said, the most prominent political figure in the recent Montenegrin history, Milo Djukanovic, by financing, supporting the stronger opposition political party, Democratic Front. Consequently, the Special Prosecutor Office opened a court case on attempt coup against some of the Democratic Front leaders, several Serbian nationalists, and two Russian military intelligence officers. The government held the stance that Russia was meddling not only in 2016 parliamentary elections, but also in anti-NATO protests a year before, in 2015, organized by this pro-Serbian coalition bloc called Democratic Front, calling into question development of bilateral relations between two states. As a result, the two Russians and the 9 Serbian citizens and the two high-ranking officials of the opposition party, Democratic Front, were found guilty, yet a little evidence have been provided of Russian meddling in the parliamentary elections and their attempt to stage a coup. When we talk about the China, unlike Russia, China mostly relies on the soft power use over increasing its influence in Montenegro, but also in overall Western Balkans region. During the last decade, I would say that China has managed to strengthen its regional cooperation with the Western Balkan countries by the means of the sub-regional initiative called 16 plus 1, consisting of 11 EU member states and 5 candidate countries for the EU membership. Chinese interests in the Balkans substantially differ from the one from Russia, as China does not oppose towards the EU and the NATO enlargement of the Western Balkans, and mainly uses its sort of economical leverage in order to enhance its particular regional influence. Chinese investment, which is quite important to mention, are more than welcome in the Western Balkans, including Montenegro, by providing loans to the Western Balkan countries, especially by providing loans to Montenegro, who was actually given more than $800 million in order to build one part of the priority infrastructure section within the highway, Montenegrin highway. Chinese companies are visibly present on Montenegrin market, but also on the Western Balkan market by being competitive in domestic firms and reconstructing the highways, roads, tunnels, but also bridges. Therefore, it is not surprising that Montenegrin Chinese relations have been substantially emphasized as a traditional good and friendly, while the construction of the highway has been presented as a symbol of the friendship. Obviously, the improvement of the bilateral relations between two states remain the sort of consequences of the Chinese involvement in the Central Eastern Europe, primarily through the regional initiative, as I said, One Belt, One Road, displaying Montenegro as a reliable partner within the area of regional economical cooperation and development. Still, it is not wonder why the president of Montenegro quite clearly expressed the possibility to support a policy of alternatives instead of the policy of opportunities, therefore cooperating with China. In this regard, we are able to say that the Chinese commercial involvement in Montenegro has been appreciated by domestic ruling elites because it has provided substantial infrastructure loan despite disapproval of the credit from the West. But perhaps far more importantly, those policies do not interfere into the internal political processes, nor they question the political legitimacy of those semi-authoritarian regime, as it is the case with the EU conditionality policy. At the same time, this kind of the policy of the economic development of Montenegro is of the special importance of China, because China is aware that one day Montenegro will join the European Union, and therefore it will be able to lobby for the Chinese political interests. And finally, let me say something about the Turkey involvement, that the Turkey has used mainly its soft power influence through the cultural and educational program to the Western Balkans, mostly targeting the Muslim community. For instance, if we're talking about Montenegro, now there are more than 20% of the Bosniak Muslims who are living in this particular country. However, Muslims are also living in the rest of the region, in Serbia, in area of Sanjak, mostly also in Albania, in Kosovo, in Northern Macedonia as well. In any regard, the Turkish soft power has been reinforced primarily through the reconstruction and restoration of the Islamic religious object, especially from the period of Ottoman Empire, by financially being supported of the Turkish development agency TIKA. Another source of the regional influence is also observable to the establishment of the cultural centers, respectively Institutes Yunus Emre, which aims to provide more insights about the Turkish culture, Turkish language, also about the art, but about the history as well. On the other hand, Turkish geopolitical intentions and ambitions in the regions remain unclear in the terms of the EU accession process in the region. So far, Turkey has not opposed towards the integration of the region when it comes to joining the Western Balkans to the Union, but also towards the NATO as well. However, we should not be surprised if Turkey starts developing more advanced soft hard or the soft power strategy by being more competitive towards the European Union in the region. After all, the Union decision to stop the accession negotiation process with Turkey over the alleged human rights violation in this country may serve as a valuable trigger for this country to commence even more actively into the geopolitical role of the Western Balkan region by increasing the influence, at the same time undermining the Union and its potential membership perspective for the given region. I think that I'm going to stop now, since 45 minutes were already been used. So if there is any kind of questions, I'm able to.
Well, thank you very much. That has been very insightful, and especially because you have touched upon the EU and then some other forces in the region. And I would like to invite our attendees to ask questions in the chat box, or I know that we are also live on YouTube, so if there are any questions there. But I have already seen some comments that I would like to ask you to elaborate on a bit more. You were often touching upon the notion of the politics of alternatives and opportunities, which has accompanied the situation in the Western Balkans for a long time, which then I would argue is very much linked to the question, who is really not destabilizing the Western Balkans, right? Because in one way or another, even though yes, you say that Russia is destabilizing, China is not, and Turkey potentially, we still don't know for sure, but for the European Union, for the Brussels administration, then eventually China will be perceived as a destabilizing force, not necessarily right for the local elites. So based on the comment that I have seen in the box there, would you be able to tell us a bit more how you really approach this whole discourse about the politics of alternatives and politics of opportunities? Mm-hmm. And what necessarily works as an opportunity now does not necessarily work as an opportunity at some other stage?
Well, when it comes to, for instance, cooperation with China, I would say that definitely there is the politics of alternatives, especially when we talk about providing sort of substantial loans for building those sort of infrastructure projects. So in this sense, if we see that Montenegro has been already asking for those sort of loans and saying from the European banks and saying that it is really necessary to develop their own economical and the politics. Therefore, if we see that the China was the one who actually wanted to provide those sort of benefits. This was a clear message for the semi-authoritarian regime that they want to actually cooperate with this actor, therefore being extremely beneficial for them in order to keep this sort of internal political stability.
Mm-hmm. There is another comment. Who is the biggest winner in the Western Balkans?
Well, this is a tough question. I would say, well, it's very hard to say right now who is the biggest winner. I would say that so far, I would say that the if we see in the EU or the international perspective, I would say that the China was one who is actually having the sort of benefits right now, because China is measuring the time completely different than the other countries. So as I said even before, China is quite sure that one day this small Balkan Adriatic country will join the European Union. Therefore, it will be able to primarily to lobby for the Chinese political interest. So in regards with Russia, who has sort of problems how to deal with its traditional sphere of influence, but also when we talk about the European Union, who has its problems with, let's say, sort of security and stability concerns, the China is the one who is completely omitted from this particular vacuum, and it's really looking from the perspective that one day it will be able to cooperate it not just with the Montenegro but also with the Western Balkan region, in the sense that this country will join the European Union as well.
Mm-hmm. There was also a comment about your talk at some point that yes, the talk is very much about external forces, which is great, but what about the opposition? And we cannot really exclude the role of the opposition when actually talking about your EU charade thing in the region, and not only as I said in the region as the whole, not really just in the case of Montenegro, and this ongoing debate about a very weak opposition in the region, which has in the end provided the elites, semi-authoritarian elites, to proceed with the process of state capturing and clientelism. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes,
please?
of course. Well, I would say that this is primarily the strategy of the semi-authoritarian regime, how they can easily provide this sort of state capture, but at the same time, they start to undermining these sort of democratic safeguards. While the level of the autocratic rule has varied from country to country, the mechanisms of the control and influence primarily remains largely the same. All the Western Balkans semi-authoritarian regimes share the common characteristics, and this is profoundly visible with their intention to weaken democratic institutions by keeping them fragile and dependent, politically interfere into the judiciary, dealing with their political opponents, but also creating the strong political polarization within the government and the opposition. In this regard, the autocrats such as Milo Đukanović, the president of Montenegro, Aleksandar Vučić, the president of Serbia, or also Milorad Dodik, the Serb member of the state presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, have predominantly relied on mechanisms spreading the fear and creating the artificial political crisis in order to consolidate their power and strengthen their dominant position in the society. And this particular regime has been seen in changing their policy perspective, orientation, and foreign policy priorities, thereby reducing the chances of losing dominance in the state. If we see, for instance, the case of Serbia, we will see there is no any current opposition in the parliament. Situation is slightly different when it comes to case of Montenegro, but this was the situation which is, let's say, happening as of the 30th of August, when the last election has been held and when the opposition party actually took the governmental offices.
Right. Let me read one of the questions. Could a land swap between Serbia and Kosovo lead to conflict instead of bringing prosperity and European integration to the Balkans?
I personally do not believe that there is going to be any kind of conflict in the near future between, not just between Kosovo and Serbia, but also between any other countries in the region. I think this is the issue that has been done when it comes to the Western Balkan countries, and that European Union even today has demonstrated certain capacities to even prevent this sort of escalation of the war conflict. What I can see is that there should be a sort of compromise that needs to be done by both sides in order to improve those relations. So if there is a situation to recognize each other, or even to, as I heard even within the news, to give each other a certain part of the territory, I'm not saying this is primarily true, but I'm saying that it might be on the table, then definitely both sides needs to do something in order to satisfy the both appetites.
Okay. There is another comment about the role of the church in stabilization or destabilization of Montenegro in the European perspective. You haven't really touched upon that in your talk, but can you please provide us a bit with the context and why that role of the church is really being featured on a regular basis in different analyses?
But what particularly? Can you be more specific?
I haven't seen here, but the general take on the role of the church, maybe you would like to touch upon.
Well, definitely was quite evident even before the Montenegrin accession to NATO. I would say that the Russia was the one who was actually reluctant to abandon the idea of reviving this sort of pan-Slavism and concept of unification of all Slavic country under its influence. And therefore, for the purpose of expanding its influence of internal political processing and the changes in country, Russia has predominantly supported actions primarily of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro in denying Montenegrin statehood, and also it has advocated campaigns at the same time with opposition Democratic Front in opposing Montenegrin accession to the NATO in 2015. So in this sort of sense, since we do have a very strong, let's say, a role of the Serbian Orthodox Church even today, as we already know that the Serbian Orthodox Church was one of the leading factors which changed the current or the former government, and being in constant conflict with the former ruling elites. Therefore, it has been used by the Russian elites in order to deny Montenegrin statehood and identity, at the same time trying to undermine the stability of this country by showing to the partners, to the NATO and to the European Union, that this country is not capable to dealing with internal political processes and the changes in the society.
Thank you. Great. There is another question here. What are your predictions about NATO's effectiveness in the coming years, taking into consideration the statements of Macron and Trump related to NATO? Being brain dead, really, what they said.
Well, I think that there is definitely redefined, or it needs to be redefined, the NATO enlargement and the NATO policy as well, especially when it comes to this sort of overlapping with the European foreign and security policies, and sort of who has an ability to deal with the issues. We have been seeing that, for instance, NATO was the one who was dealing with the European security problems, but as of 2005, to be more precise, NATO started giving this role to the European Union, EU member states, by being more active into the process of crisis management. I definitely see this opportunity of NATO to be more developed, in the sense that it's going to give a more strength and more I would say, more individual sense of working on the security issues than it was given before.
Well, we have someone from Algeria asking, does the Syrian refugee crisis affect Balkan countries' relations with the European Union, and to what extent, really?
Well, I'm not quite aware to what extent, but definitely the fact in the sense that it has been a problem of stopping those kind of refugees, especially due to the flow that they were coming from the Turkey, then to the Balkan territory, and again, then therefore to the Western Europe country. What is the problem here is that the Western Balkan countries do not have any sort of capacity to deal with those refugee crisis and the refugee itself. Therefore, this sort of burden has been given to them, even though they're not really being able to sort this problem. Among the all problems which they're facing, unemployment, poverty, also I was mentioning sort of enlargement fatigue issues, crisis, as well. One of the biggest problem that was also given to Western Balkan region is this sort of how the region has or needs to be done with the refugee crisis. So far as I can see, this crisis has been settling down, so no further repercussion and consequences were felt on the region.
Right, thank you. Now there is also another question. I've seen it from one of the attendees asking you to elaborate a bit more about. Okay, yes, we can agree that the EU is now in a rather specific state, and probably the COVID-19 pandemic has also contributed to that, and we have seen a lot of intergovernmentalism versus supranationalism in the EU, and especially with some of its states really not very much agreeing with the general mission, if we can put it that way, of the EU. So this attendee is asking, really, it is obviously unclear what the future direction of the EU will be. So how do you think the EU's policy towards Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans will be shaped going forward? I would then add to that, what are really the risks that the EU is facing going forward?
Well, I think that the first action that has to be done by the European Union is to provide a credible membership perspective for the Western Balkan region, due to the fact that these countries were being involved into the various integration process for more than 25 years. So we are facing ourselves in a certain paradox that there are much more conditionality given to the Western Balkan region compared to the countries from the Central and Eastern Europe, but there is less likely to expect that these countries shall join the European Union in the future period. So therefore, I believe that primarily the conditionality should be the one that it has to be dealt in the way that primarily the credible membership perspective should be done, and therefore the Western Balkans should be primarily know or should know that the reward will come once the conditions are being met. On the other hand, I know that it's quite difficult for the European Union itself to provide this sort of credible membership perspective, especially due to the fact that the European Union was facing with the various crises, with the institutional crisis, with the compromise decision-making problems, also sort of burden when it comes to the structural funds, and also I would say migration employment policy from east to west. So in this sort of sense, there is a generally negative mood towards the further enlargement, and I completely understand the situation. However, what is here the trickiest thing is that the Western Balkans are waiting in the lobby of the European Union for the 25 years, and it has to be quite clearly said why this region needs to be or does not need to be joined to European Union if there's any objections from the EU member states.
Okay, fair enough. But then, what about the problem of discrepancies that we have seen coming from Brussels when it comes to different states in the queue? And this has produced a lot of, well, anxiety really amongst different states in the region, and especially after the also Bulgarian and Romanian experience, but also what we have seen recently when it comes to Bulgaria and its treatment of North Macedonia. So we obviously see certain discrepancies taking place in Brussels. So yes, it would be good to come up with a single or common position, but obviously someone is obstructing that. So if we are now analyzing policies, there are major problems there. And from my own research, when I looked at the early 90s, the situation when it comes, for example, to the Yugoslav state crisis back then, it was significantly more coherent. Yes, in the beginning there were certain problems, and the EU lacked a common position. But then, actually, in January of 1992, it did manage to develop a common position. Yes, we are talking about 12 members of the European Union back then. But so, how do we then approach the problem? Because can we really expect that the European Union going forward will be able to come up with a set of criteria, clear-cut criteria that will work for all of the countries in the queue?
Well, I don't see that there is going to be any more criteria. That will be really, really odd to expect, especially now when we see how many conditionality or an evolution of a conditionality policy has been developed towards the Western Balkan region. So there are different sets of the conditions, especially focusing on political conditions, SAP conditions, also introduction of the interim benchmarks, opening the accession negotiations as an open-ended process, also the disequilibrium clause. So I really think that it's really enough for the Western Balkan region to fulfill those conditions which are set in front of them. However, I really believe that even though the region, or even though the European Union, to more precise, was facing with the sort of the problems that was facing even today, definitely it is absolutely necessary to provide a sort of incentive for this region in order to start believing that the European future is or the Western Balkan future is within the European Union. I don't see any other reasons how or any other policies what should be developed in the sense that should be done. In any other case, I would say that if this is not possible, then the European Union is system in crisis, and definitely it needs to be redefined in order to provide a certain membership perspective for the region.
Right. In the first webinar, which I did with a colleague of mine from Australia, but originally from Kosovo, for the end of the webinar, I asked him to imagine what he would be telling me in 2025 about the problems he was elaborating on, and that was really about Kosovo and Kosovo-Serbia relations. So I really have to ask you the same thing. So will in 2025, do you think in 2025 you will be talking about charade again, or you will be writing a new manuscript and just really going against some of your previous statements that to some might be a bit maybe too harsh even?
I would love to, if there is any kind of evidence which should be convince me that I was wrong, especially when it comes to let's say the political will of domestic elites to effectively comply with the rule of law requirements. Of course, when we talk about the Western Balkans, the situation started changing from 2020, 2019, but not just in Macedonia, but also in Montenegro, as we already know that the first democratic government has been elected. So let's say that this sort of interdependency which is existing between the EU and domestic factors is quite sufficient for the development of the country towards the EU membership. However, if we see now that there is domestic factors who are really willing to fulfill those membership requirements, maybe in a certain extent the European Union will be open and therefore providing a certain benefit for them to join the European Union. Otherwise, I really see that this sort of spillover effect will happen, and therefore it will affect not just when it comes to Montenegro, but also when it comes to the Western Balkan region, and therefore being able to effectively fulfill all these requirements which are set in front of them.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Vladimir. I
Thank you very
can
much.
see no more questions here. I would like to thank you all for attending our webinar. Thank you for your time. And yes, let's see in 5 years' time how your research, but also how the situation in the region will evolve.
Thank you very much for an invitation. It was having a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.